Okay, well, welcome again. Thank you for registering for the class. We have a really tremendously interesting subject, the lost cause mythology. So this class is a combination of history and historiography, which is the study of what was written about the history. And that's how the lost cause was developed and grew. It's why we all have the view that we maintain, however different they may be, of the Civil War. And I would suggest, and as many of these historians have suggested, the views of the Civil War are typically American heroic view of the Civil War. We like to see ourselves as heroic. Born in 1947, my dad was a World War II C-47 pilot, and he sat me down when Victory at Sea first came on in 1952. Man, he sat me down. It was like religion. It was like church. 6:30, 7 o'clock on Sunday night, one of the little things just to see the black and white. But I think many Americans feel similarly about the Civil War. We see the heroism, and rightly so. We see the heroism, which was true. The heroism was dramatic on both sides of the Civil War. But we look kind of past the ugly side of it. And we don't like to talk about that. In developing the lost cause, we'll see the definition. This is not about my definition. I wrote in one of the articles in the Spy a couple of weeks ago that I got. This course is based on what I found on the website of the Southern Poverty Law Center. I didn't know that they had a web. I knew they had a web, but I didn't know they had anything about the Civil War. I got this from numerous books, some of which are available in our magnificent Talbot County Free Library. I know because I donated some of them. And I listed them in the last page of your handout. Those are really good books. I've got two more that are in my car that I'm dropping off with the library today. But the two or three that I use most in this class are the Rollin Osterweiss book. He was a Yale professor. And it's a dry history. It's what you would expect from a Yale professor. Just dry, straight facts, nothing exciting. But that is the reality. And it was a classic, thorough summarization of what happened, who wrote what and why, and who created this play or that movie, or wrote this magazine. That is a very thorough thing. And when I read that, it just completely changed my view, and it gave me the picture of why I see the Civil War the way I do. When I went back, I still have my American history textbook in high school. And I was startled to see what they said. They had these heroic, sidebars on Nathan Bedford Forrest and Lee and made heroes, and also said that the slavery had very little of anything to do with the starting of the Civil War. And I lived in Georgia for 10 years, and I was part of the Atlanta Historical Society. I was an active member. And we used to take it, we used to see it. We were encouraged to read the state of Georgia's secession statement from the legislature, which was pages, mostly all about slavery. And I looked at Mississippi, the same thing, Texas, they're virtually all about, some mentioned the tariff and a couple of other things. But the fact is that's what they said in 1861, proudly. That's what Alexander Stephens said in 1861 with his famous Cornerstone speech, which those of you who attended the Maryland class, Maryland Civil War, found out that Maryland was not added to his list of states that belonged to the Confederacy. But the fact is that, yes, it was mostly about slavery. Now, not all about, but mostly about it. These books all give various perspectives. It's not all the same. They don't say the same thing the same way. They say it in different ways. And it's really interesting. And I have some information, literally what they said out of what they have written. So we'll get to that this morning. But I want to go over the goals. That's to review the development of the law. Define, talk about the tenets, talk about how it all developed, and discuss briefly Robert E. Lee's role in the lost cause mythology, how it developed, and explain how the mythology led essentially to the glorification, to one degree or other, of the Confederate cause. It looked to look past the issue of slavery and to focus completely on the heroism, and not denying the heroism, it was there, but to talk literally about the entire picture, the economic, social, the military, and the political. And that's to give us a synthesis of what actually happened, the full picture of what happened. So let's kind of define try to define what the lost cause is. There are many definitions. Why do we have the images that we have? And why is there such an emotional pull, especially for the southern side? There's virtually no emotional pull for the Indian side. You have, I don't have it. I'm the second generation Italian American who had nothing to do with the Civil War. I'm clean. In Brooklyn, New York, where I'm from, we have this fabulous statue, like a small Arc de Triomphe. It's called the Grand Army Arc. For most of my life, when I lived there, until I was maybe 22, 23, I try on Flatbush Avenue at one of the entrances to Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And, my parents never took me there, never explained it. No teacher ever explained it in high school or in elementary school. None of us ever talked about it. My friends never talked about it. Their parents apparently didn't take them there either. But what I did learn, I didn't even know what the Grand Army of the Republic was for a long time. I thought it was the World War I. I thought it was a World War I memorial. But no, it was the Grand Army of the Republic in the Civil War. And I found out later that Kings County, Brooklyn, New York, proportionally sent more men to the Union Army than any other county in the North. Meanwhile, over across the East River in Manhattan, you had the riots in 1863, the draft riots. It was, phenomenal. So I came to become a student of history in the 6th grade when I started reading a book in my classroom, and I read it, and it captured my imagination. And I've been fascinated ever since, and my home library has now grown to over 500 Civil War books and tapes. So I pray that my house doesn't burn down because it would ruin me, because I have all those books that I literally reference, on a regular basis. But the fact is that the lost cause is a factor that has overcome the lens of candor. It is not a candid view of the war. And I'm not proposing to vilify anybody. I just want to get, to the truth, as some of these other authors have done very effectively. But in order to understand this, and I came across this, fairly recently, in order to really understand why Southerners wrote, starting in 1866, when the first book called The Lost Cause was written by the editor of the wartime editor of the Richmond, one of the two, Richmond Dispatch. He wrote the book and basically did his first history of the Civil War, because he covered it every day, and essentially blamed the Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government largely for a lot of the problems. And he sort of gave it a kind of a heroic spin other than the Confederate government. He was right about blaming the Confederate government. They had a lot to do with the problems that the Confederacy encountered and made for itself. But that was the first reference to the lost cause. Later, others chimed in, and basically the Southerners wrote their own history. But to understand the need to do that is critically important. That Southerners needed some explanation of what had happened. I gave you this handout, and it talked about in 1865, the South was largely devastated economically, socially, and militarily. Killed a quarter of the Southern white men of military age. It wounded many thousands of others. The Southern cause was weakened over time, internally, by the loss of civilian morale, desertion, and conscription evasion. There's a fabulous book called Conscription. And I should get one and donate it to the library, because it talks about how Southerners worked hard to avoid conscription and what conscription did. Remember, conscription came in early 1862, only a year after the war started. Southerners who all volunteered massively in 1861, the South could only equip and arm about half of them. And by 1862, the other half that went home, they weren't coming forward. And the 1 year enlistment of 2/3 of the army of 1861 was running out. And there was nobody to take their place. So what happened? The Congress passed the Conscription Act. And the Conscription Act kept those 1 year volunteers in for another 3 years. And all of a sudden, they weren't volunteers anymore. They were conscripts. And then the others, hundreds of thousands of others, were conscripted and drawn in. Yes?
Was that the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Congress that passed that?
No, it's Confederate Congress.
Oh.
Right. The U.S. Congress passed its draft law in 1863. Okay. So it went a whole other year without. Okay, so that's what happened. Approximately, and this is important, approximately 100,000 white men from the Confederate States fought for the Union. That is and they were essentially from the Appalachian South, Eastern Kentucky, East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, Northwest Georgia, Northeast Alabama, Western Virginia. All of those places were voted generally against secession in the first place. They never supported the war. So those men were literally from the seceded Confederate States. Then there were another 200,000 white men from slave states like Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, the border South, who also fought for the Union. And those numbers were irreplaceable. For the South needed those men. They needed those states. And they didn't have them. Now, in Maryland, there's certainly some. There were, 15,000 Marylanders fought for the Confederacy. A smaller number of Kentuckians and Missourians fought for the Confederacy. But it was, they gave up too much. They couldn't afford to give up that many soldiers, especially to the Union side, because then you also had people who wouldn't go fight either way. And the South needed every last person. So that many men fought for the Union from white men from non-seceded states. And then, of course, 150,000 U.S. colored troops were recruited from slave states to fight for the Union. But also economically, the war killed 40% of all Southern livestock. It ruined thousands of miles of railroad, left thousands of plantations and farms in ruin, destroyed the principal labor system, i.e. slavery, eliminated 2/3 of the assessed value of Confederate wealth in only 4 years. Socially, massive relocation of refugees in Virginia, for example. Richmond started the war off with a population of about 35,000. It ended the war with about close to 100,000 people. Why? Because of refugees from all over the state of Virginia and surrounding area. And this happened all over the South, where whenever the Union armies came near, people decided that they weren't safe in their homes. Now, the evidence of destruction of homes was pretty clear. Yes, there was, especially with Sherman's march through Georgia, Grant and Sherman marching in the inland, the overland invasion of Vicksburg from the south and from the east toward west toward Vicksburg. But by and large, civilians weren't burned out of their houses. Now, they suffered up in other ways. They suffered largely, and I have to say this, because most Union armies were fairly well fed from the Union side. The logistics were there. They had trains, they had supplies, they had ways of supplying their armies. Southerners didn't so much. Food was always a problem. Supplying and logistics were always a problem for the Confederate side. And what happened? Well, there was, with the beginning of the war, the Union and Lincoln passed a income tax, personal income tax. And the Southern Congress understood, Jefferson Davis understood that there wasn't enough financial wealth in the South to literally tax the poorer classes, even the non-slaveholding farmers, the yeoman farmers of the South. They didn't have much in the way of cash. They were independent because they grew enough food to feed themselves and their families and continually grow that way. But they didn't have cash. They barely paid their taxes. A lot of the time they did tax in kind. And so the Confederate side created a tax in kind, which meant that Confederate logistics people could come to any farm and take 1/10 of any farmer's produce and take it away for use for the Confederate armies. But it didn't always work out very evenly or fairly. Why? Because some houses, some families, some farms were far distant from any rail or supply depots. The ones that were close to railroads and near where armies were stationed, they suffered. They lost a lot more than 10% of what they had, and they were having a hell of a time trying to feed themselves because the Southern farmers weren't nearly as mechanized as Northern farmers. And whereas women and children in the North could continually produce vast amounts of crops, food crops, and for supply to feed themselves and feed the armies, they also fed and prevented European famines by exporting vast amounts of grain and food products to Europe, especially Russia, during the war. And so that didn't happen in the South. And so it was massive suffering because, again, starting in 1862, it became a real problem with people who were having to leave their house and becoming refugees in cities. And the infrastructure in those cities couldn't begin to meet the need of so many people. So there was tremendous suffering. The South either lost or never gained the allegiance of hundreds of thousands of people from the Appalachian South and from other slave states which refused to join the Confederacy. Okay. The psychological impact of having lost so much in a cause that was ordained as the will of God by Southern church hierarchies added further devastation. There would not have been a war. People in the South would never have gone to war unless their church, these are highly evangelical people, and they would never have gone to war without the imprimatur of their hierarchies. Bishops in New Orleans, I've had names, I can't think of their names offhand right at the moment, but they had everything to do with inspiring people that this is the will of God. And that had, for those people, it had a massive effect. If you're aware that in the late 1830s and the 1840s, there was a huge schism in the Christian churches in America. The northern churches, they didn't forbid, but they frowned upon slavery. The southern churches defended slavery. They took the story of the sons of Ham. I forgot what the verse is, what book it is. But the sons of Ham were allegedly always meant to be the servants of white people. They were the dark-colored, dark-skinned people in the Bible. And this was the basis that Southern churches interpreted the Bible. That was their interpretation. And all of the denominations in the different Protestant sects all split, and the Southerners looked at it one way, the Northerners looked at it the other way. And that was one hugely important basis. So when the South was lost the war and was devastated, they said to themselves, wait, this was supposed to be ordained by God. We're a religious people. How do we explain this? There has to be an explanation. And on top of everything, 3.5 million slaves were now free people in the midst of the 6 or 7 million white Southerners. That in and of itself for them, was a earth-shattering social change, which could not be readily accepted or would not be readily accepted by any stretch of the imagination. So some explanation for this catastrophe had to be developed. And it was. And you couldn't call it the lost cause mythology in 1860 or 1870 or 1880. But by the time the era of Jim Crow was developing and free blacks in the South were kept in their place legally, educationally, etc., and socially, Southerners could look to that level of vindication. The Sons of Confederate Veterans organization has the motto, Deo Vindice, which means God will vindicate the South. This is a vindication of sorts. And so when we look at how the need for Southerners to somehow vindicate and rationalize their effort. They worked hard. They sacrificed fantastically. They were completely committed, although there were plenty who didn't. But the large majority were in it. They stayed with it. And so they left it to authors to describe what had happened. And at first book or two came out, and then it was, what's very important was in the way the history had developed. There was a group in Lexington, Virginia, led by Jubal Early. Jubal Early was one of General Lee's division commanders. He, as you may remember, in 1864, Lee sent Early up to Washington to raid Washington, and almost did, until Grant could send a corps up, and that's where they fought at Fort Stevens, and we're at the Battle of Monocacy in 1864, just above Washington. And so Early was beaten and back down the valley. But the point is that Early became the key man. He was an attorney and a hard-bitten Lee. He would use all kinds of bad language in front of Lee. And he was the only one that Lee was allowed to do that. And he used to call him my bad old man. And finally, after Early was defeated in the Shenandoah Valley by Phil Sheridan, Sheridan did his famous ride. It was Early that he defeated, and the Southern Corps was scattered, and the valley was completely gone and lost as a supply base for the Confederacy in 1864. Well, Lee fired Early. He had to fire Early because of the complaints of civilians and within the ranks. So Lee let him go. But he didn't really want to do it, but he did it. After the war, they were all in Lexington because Lee became the president of Washington Lee College, which is right there in Lexington. Early was there, along with Sandy Pendleton, who was Lee's artillery chief, nominally, but still his artillery chief. And these men were looking for reasons, for writing their own history. But Lee, while he was alive, wouldn't let them do that. He absolutely did not want to go back. Lee, after the war, honored largely his commitment to not rebelling against the laws of the United States. And he understood better than anybody how fortunate he was that he was dealing with Grant, who was magnanimous in victory and gave not only Lee, but all those troops free pass to go home just as long as you live within the laws of the United States. But the fact is that Early still had this axe to grind, and he became enmeshed with Longstreet over the Battle of Gettysburg. This was an integral part of the beginning of the lost cause mythology, because the mythology reads, so Early died in 1870. So it was 1872 when Early and Pendleton started giving speeches claiming Lee's invincibility and saying that Longstreet was the Judas Iscariot of the Confederacy by not following Lee's orders at Gettysburg. And as a result of that, the Confederacy lost the Battle of Gettysburg, and thus later on the war. That's where this came from. You find it in the Southern Historical Society, which was the main vehicle that Early and company used to write their history. There are 24 volumes of their writings. And we often hear that the winners write the history. Not so much in the American Civil War by any stretch of the imagination. And the basis, the core mythology about Lee's invincibility, et cetera, is the Southern Historical Society. And it was written by Early, et cetera. Now, it's a complex thing. We'll talk more about it. But that's just the basis of where this basically came from. Who wrote what? Does everybody know Douglas Southall Freeman? He was He authored Lee's Lieutenants and the first major biography of Robbie Lee after the war. He was like a second generation. His father served in the Army of Northern Virginia. He was a Virginian school at the University of Virginia.
What was his name?
He was a newspaper man in Virginia.
What was his name?
Douglas Southall Freeman, Southall Freeman. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his book on Lee. He idolized Lee. His father idolized Lee and followed Lee and surrendered at Appomattox, about 25, 30,000 other Confederates. But he recognized, and I put this quote last of the, I'm going to read it first, because I think it really does summarize what happened. He said, it's impossible to realize what the death of the Confederacy meant to the South. For 4 years, the two had been synonymous. Then suddenly the South found itself 11 conquered states, each of which felt itself in a strange way the guardian of the disembodied Confederacy and the defender of its history. Even while the ashes still smoldered, Southerners began to write in them vindications of Southern rights, memorials to the fallen, personal narratives, military and political apologia. That is as good a summary as you're going to find anywhere. And I'm not sure he did it consciously, but he did it and he said it, and I think he was absolutely right. And he participated in it by lauding and idolizing and almost deifying Lee. And in the 30 or 40 years after Lee's death, what happened? The women, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the organizations that participated, women were crucial. I just did a course at, and I'll do this maybe next time here, Women in the Civil War up at Washington College. And essentially, it was the women who were started the formalization of the making it almost a religious, and it is. And the Southerners will acknowledge that the Civil War is like civil religion, sort of like college football. It's civil religion for those folks. And I was there. I mean, I ate it up myself. But the point is that women largely participated and led the deification, so to speak, the honoring, the glorification of the memory of the soldiers who died, and even the ones who lived and who later died. They glorified them. How? They did so by creating, for example, Confederate Memorial Day, going to the cemeteries, putting flowers in the cemeteries, orations about the bravery. There was no doubt that there was great bravery, but they were orations and continuing orations and, glorification of Lee and others, Stonewall Jackson, and so many others. There's a lot of those men were killed during the war, and so it was easy to glorify people like that. It was much easier to blame people like Longstreet, who lived through the war and who became a Republican after the war, because he was a long-standing friend of Grant from their time at West Point together. He was in Grant's wedding, back in the day. So it was easy to sort of like blame Longstreet, and a lot of the Southerners went right along with it, because that they weren't making up the facts; they were just following. And so it was part of the movement toward creating this history, this collective corporate memory of the Civil War. So, Freeman's comments are fantastic. William Garrett Piston is a Southern man. I met him when I was president of the Civil War Roundtable in Washington, D.C. I invited him to come speak because his book called Lee's Tarnished Lieutenant is all about Longstreet. And there was a campaign back in those days to to put a statue up to Longstreet at Gettysburg, which was essentially done. I have to say I contributed to it, not mightily, but I contributed a small amount. Because I thought it was always been historically unfair to Longstreet, because he would falsely blame, if anybody was a steady rock at Gettysburg for Lee, it was Longstreet. And so my point would be that William Garrett Piston wrote about the lost cause, he wrote that to explain how a righteous cause, blessed by God, could fail, former Confederates devoted themselves to the memory of their acts. They cultivated what historians usually call the lost cause myth. This myth and the mentality that it produced profoundly affected Longstreet's place in Southern history. It also profoundly placed Lee's place in Southern history too, which was, elevation, almost to spiritual levels. And so that's another classic example of how historians see the lost cause. Gary Gallagher is at the University of Virginia. He's written, and spoken. He's been a talking head, on many of the Civil War journal shows, and he's a well-known guy. He wrote in one of his books that during the decades following the surrender of Appomattox, they nurtured a public memory of the Confederacy that placed their wartime sacrifice and shattering defeat in the best possible light. This interpretation addressed the nature of antebellum Southern society and the institution of slavery, the constitutionality of secession and the causes of the Civil War, characteristics of their wartime society, and the reasons for their defeat. Some tried to create a written record that would influence later historians. In terms of shaping how Americans have assessed and understood the Civil War, lost cause warriors succeeded to a remarkable degree. Robert E. Lee serves as the obvious example of that success. All of the above. Now, the other part of this, and the other part we'll get to it next week and the week after, was it wasn't just writing histories of the war. It was writing romantically about the antebellum South. What was Gone with the Wind? Remember? Well, a lot of writers, some of whom were veterans, poets. Sidney Lanier was the poet laureate of Georgia, for example. In Georgia, everybody knows about Sidney Lanier. Lake Lanier, north of Atlanta, was named for him. He was a soldier. He was captured. Spent time at the Point Lookout prison in Western Shore, St. Mary's County, Maryland. Got sick, shortened his life some, but he still wrote prolifically. So it was people like that who wrote romantically about whether they were writing about the marshes of Glenn County, Georgia, or about Lee, or about the Confederate, some army, or some romantic view of the South. I mean, I was in Atlanta at the beginning of September, for a Georgia Tech football game. I still live in Dyer every week with Georgia Tech Belichick. Mostly dying lately. But the fact is that I was walking around the campus and, in Midtown, and I walked past Margaret Mitchell's house. And it's beautifully kept, it's really immaculate, But it reminded me of her role. And I also passed by the Fox Theater, which in 1939 premiered Gone with the Wind. And that was a massive impact on the mythology of the lost cause and the way most Americans today see plantations and see the relationships between the plantation families and blacks. And it's wrong. It is very wrong. But that's what it is. This was part of how the lost cause developed. In 1939 here in Maryland, in the Maryland course, I didn't realize this until I was researching for that class. But it wasn't until 1939, when Gone with the Wind came out, that the Maryland State Legislature adopted officially "Maryland, My Maryland," the song. Yes.
I lived in Nashville for 42 years, 1975 to 2017. And there's a section of Nashville development based on right around the 50s. So the main street through that development is called Robbie Lee Drive. There's something called Shy's Hill, you probably know Shy. And one of the other main streets is called Terrone Drive.
Terrone,
Right after.
Well, you know, there's a huge business in Atlanta, tourism business, driving buses all around. And one takes you, it's the Tara tour that goes down to Jonesboro area where they still have a lot of, you know, really great, beautiful buildings, old plantation type buildings. But allegedly, if you take the Jonesboro Road, which my sister, you know, believes, you know, she just loved going with the wind from the time she was a kid. She was so excited about me moving to Atlanta, she had to come down so she could take the bus tour to go down the Jonesboro Road to see Tara. That's how it grips. It's gripping. That was a work of art. That novel was a work of art. It was powerful. It was as powerful as Harry, the lady who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it was, I would say, it had more of an impact on Americans. It has, certainly there was no movie about Uncle Tom's Cabin, was there? I don't go to the movies. The point is that that's the way the lost cause mythology took its grip. Not only that, but you had in 1915, the year we put up the Talbot Boy statue, the Birth of a Nation came out. And you know, if you were in the White House, you could, maybe President Wilson would have invited you to the White House to see that movie in the White House of the United States, which he invited people to do. That was powerful. That was more, obviously more overt even than Gone with the Wind. But those were the kinds of things, and there were plays, the play Shenandoah, and there were other plays which, you know, I went to a lot of plays as a kid. But there were, you know, The Music Man and My Fair Lady. They were, the renditions of how wonderful the South is, the antebellum South. But I saw Showboat, and you know, that guy sang Old Man River, and that was powerful. That was truly powerful. And so I think that when you look at the accumulation, we'll go over some of that stuff. And if you really want to see the summary and really get into it hard and fast, the book by Roland Osterweiss, the Myth of the Lost Cause, 1865 to 1900, goes over chapter and verse. You can't miss the significance of how he summarizes something, how he pulls things together, literature, novels. You know, as a kid, I remember very well going to the Kingsway Theater on Coney Island Avenue and Kings Highway, and watching Brer Rabbit. What was the Song of the South? I mean, I was skipping home, thinking about how beautiful and wonderful it must have been, you know, in the South. It captured my imagination. And as I got a little bit older and I started watching college football with my dad, and Georgia Tech was playing, and these were the Yellow Jackets in Atlanta, Georgia, the New South. Well, that was really, truly exciting. I got to live there. I couldn't wait to get down there and to move to Atlanta and go to my first Georgia Tech game. That was part of growing up, learning what I had to learn as a kid about the South. I thought it was just, you know, a romantic, heroic place. And, you know, in some ways it was and is, but in a lot of other ways, it's a myth. And it's fun. But, you know, when you live down there, you live the Civil War every day. You know, I lived in Cobb County, right across the Chattahoochee from Fulton County where Atlanta is downtown. So I used to cross every day, and when I crossed the river on the bridge, there were signposts. Everywhere you go in Atlanta, there's signposts that the Army of the Cumberland crossed here. Right behind my house is in Vinings, the little town of Vinings Station. There was a hill, which you could go climb up. And when you do, you could see Atlanta. And that's the first look that Sherman got on his campaign to Atlanta. So his first close-up look of Atlanta. When you go to a football game at Bobby Dodd Stadium, it's on the southern end of Grant Field borders on North Avenue. North Avenue was the first trench line of the inner defenses of Atlanta. Everything is history there. It's fabulous. But when you're thinking about it, you can't really confuse the mythology from the history. It gives you a chance, living there gives you a chance to really see the history and feel it.
You don't even have to go all the way down south. I lived in Arlington, Virginia for close to 30 years. Every road was Lee, Jackson, occasional Mass.
Davis Jackson.
Yeah, Davis. Schools were named after him. It was just civil. It was living in Washington and then crossing the river. It was moving to another country. That's what it felt like. And if you went down to Richmond, you had the avenue with all the Confederate statues. The cemeteries, I mean, it was unbelievable.
I can't wait. We have a grandson who is a freshman at VMI. He's a lacrosse player.
Yeah.
So we're going down to see him in 2 weeks.
They're still fighting.
Well, yes, the alumni. And that's why they do this. It's the imagery. They took down the statue of Stonewall Jackson right in the middle of the campus there. That was a religious, a horrendous thing to do. I mean, from the standpoint of the mythology, it was completely unacceptable. And many of the alumni who are opposed to the African American commandant of the institute now are fighting tooth and nail to have him canned. I mean, this is tradition, but it's mythology based. So I can't wait to get back to Lexington myself. I don't care about the football game, with VMI. I can't wait to see my grandson. I'm not going to watch him play lacrosse because the season hasn't started. I want to get back to see the cemetery in Lexington where Stonewall Jackson's buried and Jubal Early and that whole crew. It's like a who's who of Confederate, leaders that are buried in the
Not his arm, though. Stonewall Jackson's arm is not.
That's right.
That's right.
Going to station.
Well, that's a memorial.
Yeah,
It is. It's like a religious thing, and to think that after the murders in Charleston, those murders in the church X years ago, to think that the state of South Carolina with their governor removed that almost religious image of the flag, of the Confederate flag at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina. That was momentous for those people. To think that the University of Mississippi bans the Confederate flag from campus, from football games, where as a kid, I can remember that everybody had a Confederate flag and was waving the little Confederate flag at the game. They were the rebels. They still are the rebels. To think that Georgia took the flag took the small vision of the flag out of their state flag. These were monumental, happenings in the, that of recognition that of the remnants of white supremacy, the same white supremacy that the Confederacy fought for. We all know the only three differences in the Confederate Constitution than the U.S. Constitution. Number one,
Slavery.
that's third. Number one is the massive difference of only one 6-year term for a president. That was very important. Number two was the line item veto for the president. In the Constitution, the president during his one term had a line item veto power of the Confederate budget. And number three the permanent institution of slavery. Those are the only three differences in their constitution from the U.S. Constitution. So the war wasn't about the line item veto, and it wasn't about the one term. And all that commitment and all that bloodshed and all that suffering. And for 100 years after the war, all of that domination and cruelty was, that's what.
I have a question for after the war, when all the plantations were divided and taken over. What about the people that had supported the Union? Did they lose their homes too? And farms, right, plantations?
If they stayed there, this is an interesting fact. If they stayed there, they were generally let alone. And the same with Southerners. You hear that every house, if you listen to Georgians, every house between, Texas and Richmond was burned by Sherman at some point during the war. But generally speaking, if Southerners, Georgians and whoever stayed in their place and they didn't cause, problems, they were left there. They had things taken. The livestock was, anything that would help the army was taken, destroyed. No question. Rails, everything of industrial value, smashed. But people who are well-known secessionists, they had their houses burned. When Mary Chestnut wrote that you could see she could follow the line of burnt houses all the way up to her own place, she was probably right. They were the wealthy secessionists who everybody knew who they were. Just like in Maryland, everybody knew who the secessionists were. Everybody knew who the Unionists were. And, the fact that so many more people weren't murdered when their sons were all shooting at each other, that's almost a miracle. But the point is that it wasn't complete devastation for people who, for secessionists in Georgia. Unionists had the same thing. There was, it's not like you had a tattoo, on your head. People did change their views during the course of the war. But I think that the effects of Sherman and the devastation and destruction of homes was overstated. The destruction of property was not overstated. So I think that that's as fair a thing. You said something, it reminded me of something. I can't think of it, but it'll pop into my head about 3 o'clock in the morning.
Know about that.
But how many of these big plantations that you're talking about that obviously pre-war owned slaves, so you couldn't survive without them, how many of those were actually pro-union, even if the slaves were freed and the army took all the goods? And there were people that were pro-union?
There were probably a handful you could count on. You don't have to take your shoes off to count your toes. You can, very few. Because it was their livelihood.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there were plenty of chances. People have asked me in the past, what could have prevented the Civil War? I think that there are two groups that could have prevented the Civil War. Number one, as I alluded before, the Southern churchmen. The Southern churchmen could have said, no, we're not going to do this. We acknowledge that the story of the sons of Ham, that's not legitimate, in this case, in this day and age. And the other group was the planter class, i.e., the planters who owned 20 or more slaves. Beyond that, there were the largest plantations, the 50, 100 or more. They were the ones, and why do I say it? Because it was these people who were the educated Southerners. These are the ones who sent their sons to Princeton and Harvard. And they were highly educated people. And they ran the state legislatures. They ran the state legislatures in their own interests. That's really what happened. And they controlled the media. They controlled the newspapers. The Charleston Mercury was New Orleans Times Picayune. Even Atlanta was only a small town. Atlanta was 9,000 people in 1860. It grew exponentially during the war because it was the transportation. But the point is that it was these planters who controlled the legislatures, and in doing so, they wrote the laws. They wrote the laws to benefit themselves. They had no, I mean, there were some people, who could read. There were white people, plenty of people who could read in the South, but not very many of them had access to daily media, to newspapers or maybe weekly media. The way they got their news was weekly at the county seat when they went to sell whatever produce they could sell and trade with other people. And the propagandists, they were there too, speechifying and talking about how difficult things are, and that's how society was controlled back in those days. You couldn't turn the TV on and watch Walter Cronkite or NBC or whatever. That's how it was done. And if you were educated and you were an orator and could speak, you were largely in control of that society. Many people in the South hardly ever left their county, much less the state, much less the South. But if you were a planter, you spent your summers in Maine, or you went to the races in Saratoga. You did all that stuff. You spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars on clothing and furniture in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in New York, and Boston. Those merchants, they looked forward to seeing Southerners come because they kept them large in business to a great extent. They greatly enhanced their annual profits. They had the money to do this. Some of them, took European vacations. Some of them sent their children to be educated in Europe. They spoke European languages as well. But if you were 25% of Southern whites owned neither slaves nor land. They were virtually destitute. They feared abolition of slavery more than anybody. Because slavery was the only thing that kept them free from their standpoint. The other 50% more were the yeoman farmers. They owned no slaves, but they had enough land and big families that could continue to grow their arable property and to make it more productive. But they hardly participated at all in the market economy, i.e. cotton, rice, sugar. They didn't participate in that. But in the Deep South, 80% of the cotton was grown, 100% of the sugar, and 100% of the rice was grown there. That was the market economy. Most yeoman farmers grew such small amounts of cotton that it was negligible in the big economy, in the overall economy of the South. And so the image of Gone with the Wind makes it look like everybody lived like Tara and 12 folks. They didn't. They were poor. They couldn't afford an income tax, and that's why they had to pay the tax in kind for what they grew. And so the difference between the wealthy Southerner and everybody else was massive. In the North, politicians had to please the working classes to get reelected. So thousands of workers in the cities, in the northeastern cities, and even in places like St. Louis. I was doing this other course that I'm doing on the border south. I had to look at Kentucky and especially at Missouri, which was another slave state that did not secede. And St. Louis, by 1860, had turned into the 6th or 7th largest city in America. Why? Because of the influx of immigrants. from Europe and other states. It had become.
Weren't they also the staging area for going west?
Absolutely, St. Louis became that, and it was more than that. It was the Mississippi. It was the main stop along the Mississippi on the way to New Orleans. For the crops and cotton and feed and all that other business. So it had, it was incredible how St. Louis had grown, but it was very much like Baltimore. Baltimore was very much built on the northern model with white natives and white immigrants from Europe, again, Germans and Irish. And for the South, for Baltimore and Maryland to be part of the Confederacy and reintroduce slavery in the city of Baltimore, which was built on the northern model, which traded heavily with the North, that wasn't going to work. And they knew it. And one of the reasons why the legislature acted the way it did, angry as it was for Yankees to be coming through Maryland to defend Washington, they knew that it was almost suicidal, to secede, but they knew, as Alexander Stephens knew, that Maryland and Baltimore had no place in the Confederate States of America. And that is, it was crucial to any place with a substantial city, yes.
And if I can take a step back to what you were saying earlier, and I'm thinking of the economy in the South and the independent farmer who had enough land to feed his family. But as you said, he had to have a large family to
That's
supply the
that's a big
cans.
reason why they did.
So when these kids all grew up, who gets the farm? Is it just the British thing, the oldest son, and the others all have to learn a trade, or what do you do?
Well, you go west. You go where you can buy cheap land, and that's why the go west was really important to Southerners, because they knew what was happening. They could see that the old slave states like Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, even. Virginia is the best example. Virginia in 1860 had 490,000 slaves living in the state. It was a huge state. But the money, the price, they traditionally used tobacco, not cotton. And the price of tobacco had been dropping precipitously for 30 years. It was down to 10 cents a pound or some minuscule. You couldn't make money with it anymore. That's the reason why in many areas of Maryland as well, the slave owners were leaving the business of cotton, of tobacco, because they couldn't make money. They could make much more money growing food crops and shipping them up on a barge to Baltimore and make much more money like that. And you didn't need slaves for that. And so before the war, Maryland did what the South had to fight a war to do, and that is create tenant farming and sharecropping. Tenant farming and sharecropping existed well, and especially here on the Eastern Shore in the late 1850s. But the planter class wasn't about to change its control. Yes.
So you painted a really interesting picture of what the times felt like, or what they were like. But I'm curious that if there were so many people who were poor, why did they support this?
Fear of abolition. 3.5 million slaves, black people, who they didn't consider human in some cases.
You mean that they would flood into their neighborhoods?
They would be free to go wherever they wanted. And especially for the poorer people, especially those who didn't own slaves or land, they would be their direct competition to be the mechanics, and there was tension already with those very poor white people because it would be easier for a planter to teach his slave how to do, some chore that you wouldn't have to pay some poor white dude to do the same thing and not do as well. So, that was the social aspect of this was truly powerful. Yes.
You also mentioned 100,000 white men from the Confederate States that fought for the Union. You mentioned places like East Tennessee, West Virginia, et cetera. What were the factors that caused those people to go with the Union versus the Confederacy when they lived in the South?
Okay.
The-
The trick is,
Yeah.
it was the Appalachians, the mountain country, where there wasn't the kind of land that you need to grow cotton. So there were very few slaves.
Mm.
There were in some areas there were virtually none. And as a result, these people understood that, there was slavery and people were making more. They were angry. West Virginia, one of the reasons why western 33 counties of Virginia would not secede was because of tax issues. The Tidewater planters who controlled the state house in the state of Virginia would not tax the slaves. They would only tax the land. And the people who couldn't own slaves and didn't and had no interest in it, they were paying taxes the same way that these ultra wealthy people wouldn't tax themselves. They controlled the state houses and the laws in their own interest. Yes.
What percentage of slaves in the South fled to the North after the war? And what percentage stayed approximately?
That's a good question. I don't know that there's a good answer for that.
Didn't some of the northern states forbid blacks from entering the
Yes,
state?
right. Slavery was rampant throughout. I have to say that there were unionists. I mean, I could talk about Maryland. There was unionists and secessionists in Maryland. Unionists, well, not necessarily by any stretch of the imagination, anti-slavery. They felt that slavery would best be protected within the Constitution of the United States. And so did unionists in the South. They felt that was all about maintaining slavery. But after a while, they realized that they could do better without slavery and make just as much, if not more, money on the crops, the way they earned their money and used their land than if they had slavery. Yes.
Before the Civil War, was there a railway system in the South?
Yes, but it wasn't nearly as not nearly as much mileage, and it didn't get to whole chunks of area. There were, for example, in Mississippi, there was one main north-south, one main east-west line, mostly going through Jackson, the capital. But other than that, there were spurs, but there were few cities. Everything was different. They used waterways traditionally to get their cotton to market. And railroads were, they were not necessary unless, of course, they helped the planters get their product, get their cotton to market. It helped planters if they were in the middle of Georgia, the central part of Georgia. Atlanta was growing because the planter class in that area was far enough away from the rivers that went south and toward the coast. There was no river. The Chattahoochee goes down and finishes up in the Gulf, but it's a long way and it's not terribly navigable in large areas. So they could really use railroads. And so that's why they were built in Atlanta. Same with the farmers in central Alabama. They could use the railroads, and there were railroads there, but not nearly as many as anywhere in the north. And the surprising thing, when you really analyze what really was going on in the last 20 years prior to the war, was the incredible growth in the Midwest. The cities in the Midwest were phenomenally growing. Iowa and Michigan, Ohio was already Cleveland, and numerous other cities, Ohio was really already growing into a major state. But, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, there were substantial populations by 1860 in all of those states. And these were like Northern European people who were very industrious, and they were already, living, a lot of them in cities. Of course, the farming, in 1860 census, 65% of the people in the Union, in the northern states, lived on farms. Only 35 or so percent lived in cities. Now, the farms were far more mechanized because of the kind of crops that they grew, and because of the money that they had a banking system that loaned money so that family farmers could buy equipment and thus work more arable land. And so that had leaped over the 20 years prior to 1860 in the north. In the south, they didn't have it. They had farm implements, but it wasn't nearly as sophisticated as the north, and certainly not as many. And with the large numbers, here's a key point. In the 20 years prior to 1860, I don't know exactly how many, but millions of European immigrants came into the United States. All of them came and did not go into the slave states because there wasn't as much opportunity as for tradespeople and for artisans and things like that.
Housing, anything they need.
Exactly. And so as these people came in, they first generation lived in poverty in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, but their children were educated in the public school systems of those cities. And by a generation or two, they were on the move to Ohio and Illinois. And so that's what happened. In the 20 years prior to the Civil War, 200,000 white Southerners left the slave states. Their immigration from Europe was minimal because Europeans didn't want to compete with slaves for jobs.
Yeah.
And there were no cities, or very few, and little industry. You couldn't really become a manufacturer. This is where the South was really lost the war in the 10 or 20 years prior. They often complained about how they were being controlled by the northern industrialists who took their cotton and made tons of money by finishing the cotton into goods, clothing, and others. They could have done that themselves. Why didn't they do that? Because slave labor. You couldn't keep slaves together you had to keep them in order to maintain control of the gulag. You had to keep them isolated. And you couldn't put them in a large city because they would communicate with each other. They would also communicate with poor white people and find out that they had many of the same problems. And so the point is that immigration of white people before the war was out of the South mostly and not into the South. And that's what kept their population so, controlled so low over as the North continued to grow. They knew that. They knew what was going on. The planter class did, but they fought it. They didn't buy into it. And very importantly, they would not compromise on slavery. That's why I think they're the other group that could have stopped the Civil War. Had they simply compromised and honored slave marriages, keep slave families together and not separated, that would have gone such a long way to dampen the criticism, minimize the criticism in the North, and their own guilt, really, in their hearts and minds when they separated mothers from children, husbands from wives, and sold them off because maybe somebody did something out of sorts, challenged the slave master or the overseer. That's the way they did things. That's the way they controlled the slaves. And it wasn't just beating them, it was separating them. They had the power to do that. And the planter class could have done that. They were oftentimes urged by churchmen to do that. Churchmen didn't like to see that. They understood the importance of the presence of God in the sacrament in marriage. But the planter class was in control of that society. They felt it was necessary. So they could separate any family that they wanted, treat them as cruelly, keep them uneducated. They all knew that, that once they educated slaves to read, as Frederick Douglass would say, I'm no longer really a slave if I can read the Bible, if I can read. And so they knew that, and they kept them purposely under those circumstances to maintain control. They had the power to compromise and change the way they managed those southern slave states. Yes.
Another question, kind of a follow-on to the one I just asked about the 100,000 white men from Confederate states that fought for the Union. So I understand why they didn't want to succeed and all of that, but what would cause them to pick up arms and fight with the Union when their state had seceded and so forth? You know what I'm?
Yeah.
Is it?
They didn't like slavery.
Yeah.
They understood the horror of slavery, and and a lot of people understood what the damage that slavery was doing to the South. Maybe they read the book called the book by Hinton Helper. Hinton Helper was a North Carolinian who was pretty well educated and wrote a book on, I can't think of the title of it, but it was basically an economic view of the limitations of the Cotton South. And what it was doing to the rest of that. He had the ideas of Southern industrialists, that if we would simply make our own cotton and finish our own cotton, we could keep that wealth in the South. If we had all this timber, all this great wood, the forests in the South, think of what they could do with becoming furniture manufacturers. But the wealthy people got their furniture from the North. The really wealthy ones could get it from Europe, and they did, and that's why they complained about the tariff, because the only people who had to worry about the tariff were the wealthy, because it was only a tariff on imports. There was no tariff on exports, but they complained bitterly about the tariff because they're the ones who were importing things from Europe. I mean, that's how gross it was, and that's how some poor people understood they were being abused by their political overlords. It's 11:18. I think I'm past my time.
Time for questions?
Questions? Suggestions? I'm sorry, I didn't read these narratives from Frank Vandiver and Gaines Foster, David Blight of Yale. But key thing is Frank Vandiver and Gaines Foster are Southerners. They taught at Southern schools. A lot of this lost cause historiography came from LSU, from important schools in the South. So it wasn't Yankees writing about the South. It was Southerners writing about the South, recognizing that this was they're self-limiting themselves 50, 75, 100 years, and now 125 years, 160 years after the Civil War was over. And so it's important to just have a look at that and take a look at it. And if you get a chance, use our marvelous library to take out some of these books.
Where are we going next week?
Next week, we are going to talk about the tenets of the lost cause mythology. What are the tenets of the law? What does it say